On April 1, 2003, Hong Kong received a piece of news so shocking that many people refused to believe it at first. Leslie Cheung, singer, actor, icon, and one of the most beloved stars in Asia, had fallen from the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. Because it happened on April Fool's Day, the first reaction for many was disbelief. It had to be a rumor. It had to be some cruel joke. A man like Leslie Cheung did not simply vanish in a single evening. He was too famous, too admired, too deeply woven into the emotional lives of millions. But within hours, disbelief turned into horror. The news was true. Leslie was dead at 46, and in that moment it felt as if Hong Kong itself had gone still. This was not the death of a fading star from another era. This was the loss of a man whose face, voice, and presence had defined popular culture across generations. What made the shock so much heavier was the contrast between the public image and the final act. Leslie Cheung was not known as a man collapsing openly in front of the world. He was elegance, charisma, refinement, mystery. He had survived reinvention, conquered both music and film, and become the rare kind of celebrity whose fame no longer depended on trends. To fans, he was not just successful, he was untouchable. That is why the image of his death felt so brutal. A superstar who once seemed larger than life was suddenly reduced to one terrible moment outside a luxury hotel. The beauty, the glamour, the applause, the legends, none of it could protect him from the darkness that had been growing where the public could not fully see. And that is what made the event feel less like ordinary tragedy and more like a wound. People were not only asking what happened, they were asking how someone so adored, so luminous, so seemingly in command of his image could disappear like this without warning. But the story of Leslie Cheung cannot begin and end with the fall. That moment shocked the world, but it did not explain the man. To understand why his death became one of the most haunting losses in Asian entertainment history, we have to look beyond the headlines and the hotel. We have to go backward, before the final note, before the public grief, before the candles, flowers, and mourning crowds. Because Leslie was not only a tragic ending, he was a childhood shaped by distance, a young man searching for belonging, and an artist who gave the world beauty while quietly carrying pain it did not know how to hold. The fall made history stop for a moment, but the deeper tragedy had started long before anyone looked up at that hotel and realized he was gone. Long before the applause, before the headlines, before millions of people learned to associate his face with beauty, melancholy, and impossible charm, Leslie Cheung was simply a boy growing up in Hong Kong inside a family that could provide comfort, but not always closeness. He was born into relative privilege, yet privilege does not protect a child from loneliness. In many stories, wealth is mistaken for warmth, and security is mistaken for love. But childhood is shaped less by what surrounds a person than by what reaches them. And in Leslie's case, what seems to echo through the early years is not abundance but distance. He grew up in a household where emotional intimacy did not always come easily, and that kind of absence can leave marks no camera can see. Even when a child is surrounded by people, he can still grow up feeling strangely untouched. That tension matters, because it helps explain the emotional atmosphere that would later define Leslie's art. Longing, restraint, fragility, and a kind of sadness that always seemed just beneath the surface, even in beauty. As he grew older, that sense of distance did not simply disappear. It became part of the inner world he carried with him. Leslie was sensitive, observant, and deeply aware in ways that often make childhood harder rather than easier. He was not the kind of personality that could pass through life lightly. There are people who learn early how to protect themselves by becoming loud, hard, or impossible to read. Leslie became something else, elegant on the surface, but porous underneath. Even before fame, he seemed like someone searching for belonging in places that could never fully satisfy that need. His years abroad in England only sharpened that feeling. Distance from home rarely solves loneliness when loneliness has already become part of how a person moves through the world. Instead, it can make identity feel even more fractured. Not fully here, not fully there, never entirely held by one place or one certainty. That emotional dislocation would later become part of Leslie's magnetism. People were drawn to him because he seemed both present and unreachable, intimate and untouchable at the same time. But those qualities did not begin with celebrity. They began much earlier, in the shaping of a young man who learned to carry feeling quietly. That is why the childhood of Leslie Cheung matters so much to the story of his death. The world would eventually see him as polished, legendary, and almost impossibly composed. But legends are still built on human beginnings, and human beginnings are rarely as glamorous as the myths that come later. Before he became an icon, Leslie was a boy trying to find his place inside family, culture, distance, and emotion. Before he became a symbol of style and sophistication, he was someone learning how to live with inner absences that success could never fully erase. And perhaps that is the hidden sadness at the center of his life. The world eventually loved the man he became, but the boy underneath may have been lonely long before anyone thought to look closely. Before the star, before the idol, before the tragedy that would freeze a city, there was a child who had already begun learning how to survive without always feeling at home in the world around him. Leslie Cheung did not rise the way ordinary stars rise. He did not simply become popular, release a few hits, and fade into the background of another era. He became a phenomenon. First came music. In the 1980s, Leslie emerged as one of the defining voices of Cantopop, and what made him stand out was not only his success, but the emotion inside it. He could be glamorous without feeling empty, romantic without feeling artificial, and stylish without losing vulnerability. His songs did not just create fans, they created attachment. People did not listen to Leslie the way they listened to a disposable chart star, they projected themselves into him. Then came the explosion of his screen presence. If music made him famous, cinema made him unforgettable. Leslie was not simply beautiful on camera, he was hypnotic. He had the rare ability to hold both elegance and pain in the same frame, which is one reason audiences could never fully look away from him. He brought sensitivity to masculinity, complexity to desire, and a kind of emotional danger that made him impossible to reduce to a single type. He was not built like a conventional idol. He was far more interesting than that. He made popularity feel artistic, and artistry feel intimate. That is why his rise in film was not a side career. It was a transformation into something larger than celebrity. In A Better Tomorrow, he carried youth, innocence, and emotional fracture all at once. In Days of Being Wild, he became the embodiment of restless longing. And in Farewell My Concubine, he delivered one of the most haunting performances in Asian cinema, creating a character so wounded, layered, and unforgettable that the role fused permanently with his own legend. This was the real power of Leslie Cheung. He did not simply play emotion, he exposed it. He could make sadness look seductive and make beauty feel dangerous. The camera adored him because he was never superficial inside it. Even when he looked composed, there was always something unresolved moving underneath the surface. That tension is what made him timeless. Leslie was not just handsome, talented, and adored. He was artistically alive in a way that many stars never are. He could move between pop concerts and art house cinema without seeming divided, because both worlds fed the same quality inside him, an ability to make feeling visible. The public saw a superstar, but what it was really responding to was a deeper human intensity that refused to stay hidden, no matter how polished the image around it became. By the time Leslie reached the height of his fame, he no longer belonged to one crowd, one medium, or one generation. He had become everything at once: music icon, film legend, style symbol, cultural rebel, and emotional mirror for millions of people who saw some part of themselves reflected in him. He was admired by mainstream audiences, worshipped by fans, respected by filmmakers, and remembered by the culture in a way that very few artists ever are while still alive. But inside that total triumph was the first real shadow of tragedy. Because to become everything is also to lose the safety of being only one thing. Leslie's fame was no longer just success. It was expectation, projection, scrutiny, myth. The world wanted him beautiful, brilliant, elegant, tender, untouchable, and always somehow more than human. And for a while, he seemed to give it exactly that. But the more perfect he appeared from the outside, the harder it became to imagine what might be breaking behind the image. That is why the rise of Leslie Cheung is not just the story of a star becoming larger than life. It is the story of a man becoming so beloved, so mythologized, and so emotionally exposed that the world began loving the symbol even as the person inside it was growing harder to protect. What made Leslie Cheung's story so painful was that his struggle did not look chaotic from the outside. He was not the kind of star whose pain exploded constantly in public. He remained elegant, intelligent, articulate, and impossibly composed, even as the pressure around him grew heavier. But that pressure was real. Leslie lived in a time when image could become a prison, especially for someone as singular as he was. He was more emotionally open, more artistically fluid, and more personally fearless than the culture around him always knew how to accept. As his fame deepened, so did the scrutiny. The world admired his beauty, but it also watched him too closely. It adored his sensitivity, but often without understanding the cost of carrying it. And when he became one of the few major Asian stars to be open about his sexuality, the attention around him became even more intense. That decision made him important, brave, and unforgettable. But it also placed him inside a harsher spotlight, one that judged not only his work, but his existence. Leslie was not merely performing under pressure, he was living under it. That is why the darkness in his life feels so haunting now. Depression does not always announce itself in ways the public can read clearly, especially when it lives inside someone who has spent a lifetime mastering elegance. Leslie did not collapse in a way that allowed the world to prepare itself. He kept moving, kept appearing, kept carrying the image people had built around him, and that may be one of the saddest truths in his story. The more beautiful and composed he looked, the easier it became for others to believe he was untouchable. But suffering does not become less real because it is hidden well. In fact, sometimes it becomes harder to reach. Leslie was dealing with intense emotional pain, and like many people who live with depression, he was fighting a battle that could not always be seen from the outside. The world saw refinement. The world saw grace. The world saw a legend. What it did not fully see was a man trying to survive his own mind while continuing to give beauty away to everyone else. That tension between what people saw and what he was carrying is the silent war at the center of his story. By the time that war reached its final stage, Leslie had already become too symbolic for most people to imagine him as fragile in an ordinary human way. He represented glamour, artistry, desire, sadness, rebellion, and perfection all at once. But no human being can live forever inside a symbol without cost. That is what this chapter must make clear. Leslie was not destroyed by a lack of talent, or love, or legacy. He was surrounded by admiration. He was celebrated. He was remembered even before he was gone. And yet none of that could fully protect him from depression or from the crushing exhaustion of living so long beneath expectation, identity, and emotional isolation. The public saw a man who had everything, but having everything is not the same as being able to keep living inside yourself. And once that truth becomes visible, the tragedy of Leslie Cheung stops looking like a sudden ending and begins to feel like the final moment in a long, invisible war he had been fighting alone.
On the evening of April 1st, 2003, Leslie Cheung walked into the final moment of his life at the Mandarin Oriental in Hong Kong. By then, the battle inside him had already gone far beyond what the public could see. When news broke that he had fallen from the hotel, the first reaction was confusion, then disbelief, then horror. Because it was April Fool's Day, many people thought it had to be false, a rumor, a twisted joke. But it was real. Leslie Cheung was gone. He was 46 years old. And what remained behind was not only the shock of the fall, but the unbearable knowledge that someone so loved, so admired, and so culturally immortal had been suffering in ways the world could not stop. The note associated with his final moments made the tragedy even heavier because it pointed directly to the depression he had been enduring. Suddenly, the mystery was no longer whether he had died. The mystery was how a man who gave so much beauty to the world could have been carrying so much pain at the same time. That is why the ending still haunts people. Leslie did not simply disappear. He seemed to fall out of a world that had adored him without ever fully understanding what was happening inside him. What followed was grief on a scale that proved Leslie Cheung had long stopped being just a celebrity. He had become part of the emotional history of Hong Kong and the wider Chinese-speaking world. Fans gathered in tears. Flowers appeared in overwhelming numbers. Candles, notes, photographs, and mourning crowds turned public space into a sea of love and disbelief. His funeral became one of the most unforgettable scenes in Asian entertainment history, not only because of who had died, but because of how visible the grief was. Stars came. Fans came. The streets filled. The sorrow felt collective, almost civic, as if an entire city was saying goodbye to a part of itself. That is the image that still endures. Not only the hotel, not only the headlines, but the public mourning that followed. The sight of thousands of people trying to return love to a man who had already left. In death, Leslie received the kind of open devotion that many people perhaps had not fully understood he needed while he was still alive. And that is part of what makes the funeral so heartbreaking. It was beautiful, it was massive, it was sincere, and it came too late to save him. But Leslie Cheung's story does not end with the fall, or even with the funeral. That is what makes him a legend rather than a tragedy alone. He left behind songs that still ache, films that still breathe, performances that still feel intimate and dangerous no matter how many years pass. He remains one of the rare artists whose beauty never became empty, because it was always tied to feeling. He changed Cantopop. He changed Hong Kong cinema. He changed the emotional vocabulary of stardom in Asia. He made vulnerability elegant, and elegance human. He also became something larger after death, a symbol of artistic courage, queer visibility, emotional honesty, and the terrible cost of silent suffering. That is why Leslie Cheung still matters. Not because he died dramatically, but because he lived in a way people still cannot forget. He did not just leave behind fame, he left behind longing, and that may be the most haunting legacy of all. Leslie didn't just fall from a hotel that night. He fell from a world that loved him deeply, but understood him too late.